Imagine a runaway train hurling down a track towards 5 people. You stand at the switch. By pulling it, you can divert the train onto a side track where only one person is tied down. Do you flip the switch, sacrificing one life to save 5? This classic trolley problem tests whether you believe in the principle of the greater good or you hold that killing is always wrong. Now, imagine adding a twist. What if that one person on the side of the track has a different racial identity than the other 5? Would it change your decision? It might surprise you, but there's research that suggests that for many people, the answer is yes, and the way it changes depends heavily on one's political orientation. In other words, your moral choice in this scenario may not be guided by abstract ethics at all, but by tribal instincts about group identity. Psychologist David Pizarro of Cornell and colleagues set out to probe how race and politics intersect in our moral judgments. They presented participants with a variation of the trolley dilemma. In one scenario, the lone person who could be sacrificed was named Tyrone Payton, a name stereotypically associated with a black man, and saving him would spare 100 members of the New York Philharmonic, an audience assumed to be mostly white. In another scenario, the person to be sacrificed was Chip Ellsworth III, a name conjuring a white man of old American stock, and sparing him would save 100 members of the Harlem Jazz Orchestra, assumed to be mostly black. Crucially, nothing explicit was said about anyone's race. The names and group identities did the work implicitly. When confronted with these scenarios, participants' political leanings predicted their choices in striking ways. Self-identified liberals were far more willing to sacrifice Chip, the white character, to save the black orchestra than to sacrifice Tyrone to save the white orchestra. Conversely, conservatives showed the opposite, though weaker bias. They were more willing to sacrifice Tyrone than Chip. In effect, each group's moral utilitarianism, willingness to kill one to save many, was not applied neutrally, but selectively. As Pizarro observed in a talk on the results, liberals proved just as prejudiced here as conservatives were, but in reverse, readily endorsing the death of the white man while recoiling at the death of the black man. These findings demolish the notion that people, especially politically progressive people, apply moral principles in a colorblind or universal way. If one truly believed kill one to save 5 as an absolute ethical rule, it shouldn't matter who the 1 and the 5 are. Yet clearly it did matter. A principle was invoked. It's necessary to sacrifice one for the greater good, only when it aligned with a preferred outcome, and what determined the preferred outcome was the racial identity of who lived and who died. Pizarro interprets this as evidence that our lofty moral reasoning often works backwards. We arrive at a desired conclusion first, driven by emotional tribal loyalties, then retrofit a principle to justify it. As he put it, people aren't using these principles and then applying them. They arrive at a judgment and seek a principle. In this case, liberal judgment was apparently driven by an outgroup preference, a desire, perhaps unspoken, to protect the minority individual at the expense of the majority individual. Only after that instinctive judgment they reach for a convenient ethical rationale to defend sacrificing the white character. Conservatives, on the other hand, showed a more familiar in-group preference, expressing more willingness to save their own perceived group at the expense of the other. The experiment slyly revealed that beneath the high-minded talk of moral philosophy, tribal loyalties were pulling the levers. The pattern Pizarro identified, people bending moral rules to favor either an in-group or an out-group, doesn't stop at domestic racial dilemmas. It extends to questions of national loyalty and war. In another scenario, the researchers tested participants who had to consider a military strike with collateral damage. One version described an American military operation against terrorists that would unintentionally kill innocent Iraqi civilians. Another version flipped the script, an Iraqi strike on terrorists that would accidentally kill innocent American civilians. Would those deaths be morally justifiable if the strike achieved an important objective? The results showed that conservatives, true to expectation, were more willing to justify the collateral damage of foreign civilians, the Iraqis, if it saved American lives, than to accept American civilian casualties in a similar strike. This is a classic expression of patriotism or in-group favoritism. Liberals, however, did not share this instinct. In fact, liberals tended to be equally or even more tolerant of American deaths than of foreign deaths in this scenario. In other words, liberals as a group displayed no special concern for protecting their own civilians. Some evidence even suggests the most left-leaning were less forgiving of collateral damage when the victims were foreigners, implying they found it more acceptable when the unintended victims were Americans. This is the same inversion of the usual bias, a striking willingness to harm in-group members if it ostensibly serves a greater good for others. Such a stance has been dubbed by some critics as pathological altruism. It's an altruism that many would consider excessive or misapplied, sacrificing one's own people out of concern for others. In evolutionary or historical terms, this is an outlier. Nearly all societies and cultures have valued in-group loyalty as a virtue. From an evolutionary perspective, preferring the well-being of your family, tribe, or nation is normal and adaptive, since groups that fail to protect their own members tended not to survive. What Pilzaro's studies highlight is a new moral divide. One side still favors this old age normal preference for one's own, whether defined by race, nation, or culture, while the other side has somehow adopted a moral code that inverts this preference. Liberals in these studies weren't neutral or colorblind, they actively favored the outgroup, and they aren't exactly shy about it. In modern political discourse, traditional in-group loyalty often gets attacked as racism or xenophobia, while overt outgroup favoritism is held up as a sign of moral enlightenment. Thus, patriotism in its traditional form is recast as a sin, and a cosmopolitan indifference or even hostility towards one's own people is recast as a virtue. Here is not that every self-identified liberal consciously wants to kill their own, or that every conservative is free of bias. It's that the emotional center of gravity in each worldview is different. The further left one goes on the spectrum, the more one's moral loyalty shifts away from that in-group to the point of apparent anti-patriotism. The further right one goes, the more one's instinct is to defend their kin, country, and cultural continuity, even at the risk of being labelled bigoted for doing so. These opposing moral orientations are increasingly defining our political landscape, and the old labels of the left and right are struggling to keep up with this reality. Our political vocabulary has not caught up with these developments. The familiar labels of left-wing and right-wing come from another era and increasingly serve as cognitive traps rather than aids to understanding. Historically, these terms were coined quite literally. They referred to seating arrangements of the 1789 French National Assembly. Reformist, anti-royalist revolutionaries sat to the presiding officer's left, while the conservative supporters of monarchy clustered on the right. Over the 19th and 20th centuries, these spatial metaphors evolved into an entire ideological spectrum. Being on the left came to mean favouring change, reform, and egalitarianism, from the liberal push for greater social and economic equality to radical dreams of socialism and communism. Being on the right meant favouring tradition, hierarchy, and stability, from conservative defence of existing institutions to nationalist or even fascist urges to restore a glorified past. For generations, the main axis of conflict in Western politics ran along these lines: monarchists versus republicans, capitalists versus socialists, individualists versus collectivists, secular versus religious, different shades of left versus right. Old paradigm was rooted in the social conditions of its time. In the 20th century, issues of class, economics, and the size of government largely defined one's place on the left and right spectrum. But as we progress into the 21st century, we find those old economic and institutional debates, while still present, are no longer the primary lines of battle. The salaries of billionaires, tax rates, or state ownership of industry, these are side issues compared to the looming questions of identity that underpin so many controversies today. Mass immigration, racial preferences, multiculturalism, globalization, these issues cut across old party lines and have scrambled the coalitions of old. The left-right dichotomy from the French Revolution or the Industrial Age doesn't neatly map onto questions like, should our country prioritize our own citizens over foreigners, or is it good that the demographic makeup of our own nation is changing? In a multiracial, globalized society, race and cultural identity have become inescapably salient political factors. This is not because ordinary people suddenly became more tribal than before, but because the demographics and moral narratives have shifted around them. When one group, say the historical majority of a nation, is perceived often by the intellectual left as an oppressor group whose dominance must be dismantled, and other groups cast as deserving beneficiaries of redress, politics stops being a neutral game of principles. It becomes a zero-sum contest of group interests, whether openly acknowledged or not. We see this in issue after issue. For example, policies on immigration and housing in Western countries often end up pitting the interests of working-class natives against those of newcomers. In East London, one study found that social housing rules based strictly on need tended to favour Bangladeshi immigrant families with their larger households over young local white British families, who then felt pushed out of their own communities. The researchers noted that the native white working-class residents were left seething with resentment at being leapfrogged by new arrivals. What might look on paper like an impartial, technocratic policy quickly takes on an ethnic dimension in practice. The tension between helping the other and helping our own is the quiet drumbeat beneath such debates, whether it's public housing allocation, job preferences, school admissions, or welfare and health access. Yet we persist in talking about these conflicts in the antiquated language of left versus right. This obsolete vocabulary can be dangerously misleading. It encourages us to assume, for instance, that a right-wing party must be defending wealthy capitalists or hereditary nobility, a throwback to old right of centuries past, but in fact, many so-called right-wing movements today are populist rebellions of the working class against a globalist elite. It suggests that a left-wing activist is crusading for the downtrodden workers, when in reality, today's left is often crusading on behalf of identity groups, racial minorities, immigrants, and the LGBTQ+. Even if that sometimes conflicts with the interests of the traditional working class people. In short, the content of left and right has undergone a radical realignment. Some commentators have proposed new dichotomies, globalists versus nationalists, or the somewheres versus the anywheres, or the open versus the closed society advocates. There's truth in many of these framings, but at the heart they all point to the same fundamental question: who is we? Who falls inside the circle of moral concern when tough choices must be made, and who falls outside of it? The classic trolley problem forced a choice about who lives and who dies. In a less dramatic way, even policy choice in a society asks who gains and who loses. Should a country prioritize its own citizens or humanity at large? Should the majority curb its own advantages to uplift the minorities, or should it look out for themselves? These are questions of loyalty and identity more than traditional policy. The left implicitly answers that we owe our loyalty to humanity as a whole, or at least to every other group besides the traditional powerful one. The right implicitly answers that charity begins at home, that we owe our first loyalty to our own people, however defined. It is increasingly clear that ethnocultural loyalty has become the defining marker of the new political spectrum. In today's parlance, the right wing is characterized not necessarily by devotion to king or laissez-faire economics, but by devotion to one's own people. In Western nations, this often means advocating for the interests of the historical European descendant majority. Meanwhile, the left-wing position is often characterized by a skepticism or even hostility towards the majority, frequently framing its decline as a moral necessity or simply a non-issue. If the left-wing position, in extreme form, is that it's either good or inconsequential for white Europeans to be demographically displaced in their own countries, then by necessity the right-wing position becomes to oppose that displacement and to preserve the cultural and demographic continuity of the nation. The right-wing instinct now is to stand by the native tradition and population, which is indeed a kind of tradition itself, arguably the most primal one. All other debates, taxes, healthcare, climate change, you name it, increasingly takes a backseat to this overarching divide. They still matter, but they are filtered through the lens of identity politics. Even discussions about, say, hiring foreign workers for tech jobs, quotas for refugees can't escape the gravitational pull of the identity question. Whose interests are we putting first? A person's stance on those tangential issues often correlates strongly with their stance on their core identity issue. This is why you might notice that those who take a hard line on limiting immigration, traditionally a right-wing position, often also favour policies that protect the national culture, while those who champion high immigration and diversity, a left-wing position, also push for policies that elevate minority representation and downplay the concerns of the majority. The surface issues differ, but the underlying value being tested is the same: in-group loyalty versus out-group altruism. Political language and categories must evolve to reflect this reality. Clinging to a 200-year-old label without recognizing their changed meaning can lead to dangerous confusion. It blinds us to what our opponents really believe, and even to what we ourselves really believe. Many voters have been perplexed in recent years when politicians or parties supposedly on the left start ignoring the working class economic pain, or when those on the right suddenly champion the working class but focus on immigration and national sovereignty. The confusion dissipates when you realize that the true axis of debate has shifted from class struggle to ethnocultural struggle, or one might say from economics to identity loyalty. We live in an age when moral loyalty to one's own nation or ethnic group has become a politicized, polarized choice rather than an assumed norm. On one side, we have a worldview that regards strong in-group loyalty as outdated at best or evil at worst, and thus elevates out-group concerns as a higher moral calling. On the other side, we have a worldview that sees in-group loyalty as natural and even noble, a continuation of the time-honoured duty to one's family and ancestors, now transposed to the scale of peoples and nations. This is the real debate underway, however uneasily it fits into the old left-right boxes. The problem is not just an academic thought experiment in a metaphorical sense. It is playing out in our societies. We are being forced onto new ethical tracks. Do we pull the lever that sacrifices tradition, heritage, and our own kin group in the name of a promised greater good for humanity? Or do we refuse and thereby, intentionally or not, preserve our own at some cost to the others? This is the uncomfortable question at the core of so many policy arguments today. It may not be framed this bluntly on cable news or in parliamentary debates, but it lurks under the surface of arguments about refugee quotas, affirmative action, diversity, equity and inclusion, mandates, historical guilt, and much, much more. Left and right may still be used out of habit, but they fail to illuminate where people actually stand on this fundamental moral choice. It would be more transparent to speak in terms of particularism versus universalism, or nationalism versus globalism, or perhaps loyalty versus levelling. But until such terms become commonplace, we must at least clarify what we mean by left or right in 2025. Increasingly, to be on the left means to prioritise abstract principles of equality and global humanity over the attachments of tribe, nation, or ethnicity, even if that means paradoxically endorsing favouritism towards other tribes as a way to check the power of one's own. And to be on the right means to stand for one's own people first, to see one's primary moral duty as lying with the historical and cultural community that nurtured you, and to view skepticism towards mass immigration, multiculturalism, and anti-majority policies not as bigotry, but as loyalty. We should not pretend that these philosophies can be reconciled with a few compromises on policy details. They run deep into our moral institutions, as the trolley experiment dramatically showed. One side will readily pull that switch if the one life to be sacrificed belongs to their own group, rationalizing it as justice. The other side will jam the brakes to protect their own, even if it means the greater good is not obviously served. These are polar opposite answers to the question: to whom do we owe our deepest loyalty? It's time to stop deceiving ourselves with outdated terminology. The 21st century's political landscape isn't a neat left-right line over economic policy or the size of government. It's a tug of war between competing loyalties. Understanding this realignment is the first step towards having honest, meaningful debates about the kind of societies we want to live in. We can no longer afford to let the old left-right labels cloud our vision. The stakes, who we are as a people and what we owe to each other versus to the world, are too high. This is in fact existential. So the next time you hear left wing or right wing, ask yourself not what the economic policies or historical position implies, but who is inside the speaker's circle of us and who is outside. In that answer lies the real key to contemporary politics, the new divide that will define our future forever. Thank you very much for watching. This video was based on an article from my Substack. If you enjoyed it and want to see more content like this, please check me out over at Selena101. The link is in the description. Substack is the best way to support my work.